The finality of it was the sound of a heavy oak door closing. Not slammed in anger, but shut with the cold, deliberate weight of a decision already made. On the other side of that door was everything Elara had ever known: the warmth of the hearth she had tended, the scent of the bread she had baked, the ghost of her husband's laughter in the rafters. On this side, there was only the biting November wind and the $3 Silas, her brother-in-law, had pressed into her palm. "For your journey," he had said, his voice flat, his eyes avoiding hers. It was not charity. It was severance. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead for 2 months, taken by a fever that burned through him like a wildfire through dry grass. In the eyes of the law, and more importantly, in the eyes of the town of Providence, a widow without a son was a woman without a claim. Silas, with his hard hands and harder heart, had seen to the paperwork with brutal efficiency. The farm, the livestock, the small savings tucked away in a tin box. It was all his now, by right of blood and custom. The community had watched it happen, their faces a mixture of pity and grim acceptance. This was the way of things. She stood on the porch, the wind pulling at the thin wool of her shawl. She had the clothes on her back, a small canvas sack containing a spare dress, a bar of soap, and a half-eaten apple. In her hand were the $3, cold and uselessly smooth against her skin. And in her pocket, a folded, brittle piece of paper, the deed to a patch of land Thomas had bought years ago. A foolish purchase made in a moment of whimsy. 40 acres of sheer cliff face and rockfall, 2 days' walk into the mountains. The townsfolk called it the Widow's Hole. It was considered utterly worthless, a joke he had never lived down. It was now her only inheritance. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, stepped out from his shop across the dusty street. He was a man whose opinions were as neatly stacked and priced as the goods on his shelves. "Elara," he said, his tone dripping with practiced sympathy. "A tragedy, a true tragedy. There is a wagon heading east tomorrow. I could speak to the driver, find you a place. A woman alone." He trailed off, letting the unspoken dangers hang in the air. His advice was sensible, practical, and felt like a cage. She looked from his well-fed face to the distant, jagged line of the mountains. East was a place of strangers, of charity, of becoming someone's burden. The mountains were a place of brutal truths. She met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. For a moment, the town held its breath, watching the solitary figure of the newly made widow. They expected tears, pleas, a collapse into helplessness. They saw none of it. She walked past Mr. Gable without a word and entered his store. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful, mocking note. Inside, the air smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. She walked to the back, where the tools were kept. She laid 2 of her silver dollars on the counter. "A good axe," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "And a shovel, the sharpest you have." Gable stared at the coins, then at her. "An axe? Child, what would you need with—" He stopped, a look of dawning comprehension and then disbelief on his face. "You're not thinking of going up to that rock pile. No one can live there. It's a tomb." "The axe," she repeated, her voice unwavering. With her final dollar, she bought a small sack of salt and a flint and steel. She did not buy food. She did not buy passage east. She bought the means to work, or the means to die trying. She turned her back on the murmuring onlookers, on the pity and the judgment of Providence, and walked out of the store. She did not look back. She shifted the weight of the axe and shovel in her arms, faced the mountains, and began to walk toward the wilderness that was now her only home. The journey was a punishment. The first day was a slow climb through thinning woods, the ground hard and unforgiving under her worn boots. The weight of the tools was a living thing, a beast that settled across her shoulders and drove the breath from her lungs with every step. Her world shrank to the next rise in the path, the next creek to be crossed, the burn of her muscles and the raw chafe of the axe handle against her shoulder. The sounds of the town, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant bark of a dog faded, replaced by the sigh of the wind through pine and the lonely cry of a hawk circling overhead. She was utterly alone. She slept that night, huddled in a thicket of firs, the canvas sack her pillow, the cold seeping up from the ground like a thief. She ate the rest of her apple, chewing slowly, making it last. The stars were brilliant and cruel in the black sky. A million indifferent eyes watching her small, shivering form. She thought of her warm bed back at the farm, the thick quilt, the comforting presence of Thomas beside her. The memory was a knife, and she turned away from it, focusing instead on the cold, the ache in her back, the solid reality of her predicament. Grief was a luxury she could not afford. The second day, the landscape grew harsher. The soil thinned, giving way to stone. The trees became stunted, twisted things clinging to life in the cracks of granite. She was in the high country now, a land of wind and rock. By late afternoon she saw it, a great scar of gray cliff rising from the mountainside, a sheer wall of stone 1,000 feet high. At its base, shrouded in shadow, was a dark opening, a jagged mouth in the rock. The widow's hole. She stood before it as the sun began to set, casting long, chilling shadows. It was worse than the stories. The entrance was a low, wide fissure, littered with fallen rock and damp, rotting leaves. A foul, stagnant air, heavy with the smell of decay and wet stone, drifted out to meet her. It did not look like a place of shelter. It looked, as Mr. Gable had said, like a tomb. For the first time since the oak door had closed, a wave of pure despair washed over her. Her knees felt weak. The cold dread that had been a knot in her stomach unfurled, filling her chest. The town was right. They were all right. This was not a home. This was a place to die. She forced herself to move, to step inside, her boots crunching on gravel. The air grew instantly colder, the darkness absolute. She fumbled for her flint and steel, her hands numb and clumsy. A spark caught on a piece of dry lint from her pocket, and she lit a sliver of pine she'd carried. The flame was small, fragile, but it pushed back the oppressive dark. The cave was shallow, no more than 20 feet deep, the walls slick with moisture, the floor a mess of rubble. It was hopeless. Then she felt it. A slight, steady movement of air against her cheek. A draft. It was coming not from the entrance behind her, but from a narrow crack in the back wall, almost hidden behind a curtain of damp moss. Hope is a strange and stubborn thing. It can be kindled by the smallest of signs. She held the flickering flame to the crack. It danced, pulled inward. There was something beyond. Using the blade of her new shovel, she scraped at the rock and debris clogging the base of the crack. It was loose shale, easily cleared. She squeezed through the opening, her shoulders scraping against the stone, and emerged into another space. This was not a shallow hollow, but a vast, cathedral-like cavern. The ceiling soared into darkness beyond the reach of her tiny light. And here, the air was different. The damp chill was gone, replaced by a strange, profound stillness. She walked deeper, her light casting huge, dancing shadows. She held her hand out, and she felt it again, stronger this time. A warmth. It was coming from the rock itself, a deep, resonant heat that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the mountain. She pressed her palm flat against a wide, smooth wall of dark stone. It was warm to the touch, like a sleeping animal. A geothermal vent, a seam of volcanic heat bleeding up from the Earth's core. As she stood there, Marveling at the impossible warmth, she heard another sound, a soft, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. She followed it to a corner of the cavern where, from a fissure high above, a steady trickle of water ran down the rock face. It was crystal clear, and when she touched a finger to it, and then to her tongue, it was cold and pure. A spring, deep inside the mountain, protected from the winter's freeze. Warmth and water, the two pillars of life. The despair that had gripped her moments before shattered like ice. This was not a tomb. It was a secret. It was a chance. The work began at dawn the next day. It was a brutal, relentless assault on her own physical limits. Her first task was to build a wall, to seal the main cave entrance and turn the cavern into a defensible, insulated home. She used the fallen trees from the slope below the cliff. Felling them was a clumsy, exhausting education in the physics of leverage and the sharp bite of an axe. Her hands, soft from a life of baking and mending, were soon a mass of blisters. The blisters broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. Each swing of the axe sent a jarring shock up her arms. Hauling the logs up the scree slope to the cave mouth was worse. She learned to use smaller logs as levers and rollers, her body straining with every inch gained. The muscles in her back and legs screamed a constant, burning protest. She would work until the world swam at the edges of her vision, then collapse, drink from the seep, and begin again. Failure was not an option. To stop was to freeze. To stop was to die. She stacked the logs to form a crude but solid wall, leaving a narrow space for a door and a small opening for a window. The gaps between them were enormous, a sieve for the wind. For mortar, she used the earth itself. She discovered a deposit of dense clay near the base of the cliff. She dug it out with her shovel, hauled it bucket by bucket, using a pail she fashioned from bark, and mixed it with water from the seep and dry grass for binder. She packed the thick, heavy mixture into every crack and crevice, her hands and arms caked in mud. It was slow, agonizing work. Each completed section of chinking was a small, hard-won victory against the encroaching cold. Her next project was heat. The warm rock wall was a miracle, but it wasn't enough to fight off the deep cold of a mountain winter. She needed a fire. Against the warmest section of the geothermal wall, she built a fireplace from flat stones gathered from the rockfall. It was a puzzle of weight and balance. Her first attempt collapsed. The second held. For a chimney, she looked up. High above the fireplace, a natural fissure snaked its way toward the ceiling. By building a careful flue of smaller, clay-mortared stones, she could direct the smoke into that fissure. It would vent invisibly, high up the cliff face. The day she finished the fireplace and the front wall was a day she would never forget. She built a heavy door from split logs, lashed together with rope she wove from stripped bark. As dusk fell, she hauled it into place, sealing herself inside her creation. The cavern was plunged into a profound darkness and silence, broken only by the drip of the spring. With trembling hands, she laid a fire in her new hearth and struck her flint. The kindling caught. Flames licked at the larger logs. Smoke billowed for a moment, then, miraculously, was drawn up the flue and vanished. A steady, clean-burning fire. Warmth flooded the cavern, reflecting off the stone, joining the gentle heat of the geothermal wall. She sat on the rock floor, her body one great, throbbing ache, and watched the flames dance. It worked. The town was wrong. She was still here. With the shelter secured, her focus shifted to the other necessities. Water was first. The seep was reliable, but she needed a way to store it. She spent a week digging a shallow pit in the cavern floor, a few feet from the spring. She lined it meticulously with a thick layer of the same clay she'd used for mortar, smoothing it with wet hands and packing it down until it was watertight. She then carved a small channel in the rock, guiding the overflow from the seep directly into her new cistern. It filled slowly, a pool of pure, clean water held safely within the earth. Food was the greatest challenge and her most ambitious plan. She could not hunt effectively, and foraging would be impossible in the deep snows to come. Her survival depended on an idea that everyone in Providence would have called insane: the cave garden. Deep within the cavern, in the area of greatest warmth from the geothermal wall, she began to prepare the ground. The floor was solid rock. She needed soil. So, every day, she made the trip down the mountain, her bark bucket in hand. She found a spot in the woods below where centuries of fallen leaves had decomposed into a rich, black loam. She filled her bucket and hauled it, pound by agonizing pound, back up to her cave. It was a Sisyphean task. Dozens of trips were needed to create even the smallest patch of viable earth. Her back felt as if it would break, but with each bucket load, the foundation of her future grew. She built low walls of rock to contain the precious soil, creating 3 raised beds, each about 10 feet long and 3 feet wide. They sat in the dim, perpetual twilight of the cavern, warmed by the fire and the living rock beside them. It looked like a madman's dream, a farmer's field, hidden in the heart of a stone mountain. But her garden needed seeds, and she needed more than just plants to survive. She needed protein, fat. She needed animals. That meant a trip back to Providence. The thought filled her with a cold dread, but it was necessary. She saved a small portion of her salt, packed a skin with water, and began the long walk back down the mountain. Walking into Providence was like stepping into a ghost story where she was the ghost. People stopped and stared. Children pointed. The woman who had walked into the mountains to die had returned, thinner, harder, her face weathered and her hands scarred, but very much alive. Whispers followed her like a cloud of insects. "The cave girl," someone murmured. The name stuck. She walked directly into Gable's Mercantile. The store fell silent. Mr. Gable himself stood behind the counter, his mouth slightly agape. "Ilara," he stammered. "By God, we thought—" "I need supplies," she said, cutting him off. She placed a small, rough nugget of gold on the counter. She had found it in the stream near the clay pit, a tiny flake of fortune. Gable's eyes widened. She bought what she needed, her choices causing a fresh wave of murmurs through the store. A small sack of tomato seeds, carrot and potato starters, a bag of winter wheat. Then, the truly insane purchases. She bought 2 pregnant goats and a wooden crate containing 6 laying hens. As she was leaving, a figure blocked her path. It was Silas. He looked her up and down, a sneer twisting his lips. "Still playing pretend in your hole-in-the-ground, sister-in-law?" he said, his voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. "What's this? Farming in the dark? You'll be eating rocks by Christmas." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Ilara simply looked at him, her gaze steady, and walked around him, pulling her goats behind her. His laughter followed her out the door. The journey back was the hardest thing she had ever done. The goats were stubborn, frightened animals, and coaxing them up the steep, rocky path was a nightmare. The crate of chickens was awkward and heavy. It took her 2 full days, twice as long as her journey down. She arrived back at the cave, bruised, exhausted, and bleeding from a dozen scrapes, but she had her livestock. She had her seeds. She had a chance. Inside the cave, she had already prepared a pen for the animals in a sheltered alcove deep within the cavern, where the warmth was most consistent. She filled it with dry leaves and grass for bedding. The chickens, released from their crate, clucked nervously before beginning to peck at the ground. The goats, after a suspicious survey of their new home, began to munch calmly on dried forage she had gathered. Their gentle, living sounds filled the silence of the cave, transforming it. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a farm. It was a home. As she settled into this new life, she gained another companion. A gaunt, black dog with one torn ear began to appear at the edge of the woods when she went to gather firewood. He was wary, a creature of the wild, but his eyes held a deep loneliness. She started leaving scraps of food for him, a piece of salted meat, a bit of goat cheese. She never approached him directly, simply left the offering and went about her work. For weeks, he would only come after she had gone. Then, one evening, as a cold rain slicked the rocks, she saw him shivering at the mouth of her cave, looking in at the firelight. She said nothing, but moved aside from the entrance. He hesitated for a long time. Then, with a low whine, he padded inside, shook the water from his coat, and lay down by the hearth, as far from her as he could get while still feeling the warmth. She named him Shadow. He never left her side again. He became her guard, her companion, the warmth at her feet on cold nights, a silent witness to her solitary creation. His presence was an anchor in the vast, lonely silence of the mountain. The story of Ilara's return to town and her strange purchases became the talk of Providence. The tale grew with each telling. She was mad, driven to insanity by grief. She was a witch, consorting with mountain spirits. The nickname Cave Girl was now used universally, a term of mockery and pity. Silas fanned the flames, describing her garden in the dark to anyone who would listen, roaring with laughter at the absurdity of trying to grow tomatoes without sunlight. Her folly was a source of great amusement for the town as it prepared for the coming winter. Mr. Gable, for his part, would occasionally shake his head and tell customers, "It's a shame. A good woman, lost her way. Trying to grow crops in a cave, it defies nature." He would then sell them another 50-pound sack of flour and a barrel of salted pork, the sensible provisions for a sensible winter. One blustery afternoon, a hunter named Brant, known for his arrogance and skill, actually made the climb up to her cliff face. He didn't come to help. He came to gawk. He stood outside her sealed entrance and shouted, "Heard you're raising tomatoes in there, cave girl. Let me know when they're ripe." His laughter echoed off the rocks as he left. Ilara, inside, simply stoked her fire and ignored him. Her world shrank to the rhythms of the cavern. Each day was a cycle of simple, essential tasks. At first light, a concept she measured by the slow brightening of the cracks in her door, she would milk the goats. The warm, fresh milk was a miracle. She drank some and used the rest to make simple, soft cheeses, which she salted and stored in a cool recess of the cave. She fed the chickens, their cheerful clucking a constant reassurance of life. Their eggs were precious jewels, a source of rich protein. The garden was her greatest focus. The lack of direct sunlight was a problem, but she found a solution. She polished flat stones to a dull sheen and arranged them around the garden beds, angling them to catch and reflect the constant, radiant light from her fire. It was a pale, flickering imitation of the sun, but combined with the geothermal heat from the soil and the nutrient-rich loam, it was enough. The potato and carrot tops grew green and strong. And to her profound joy, the tomato vines began to flourish, their leaves a deep, healthy green, tiny yellow flowers appearing like stars in the fire-lit gloom. Her world, sealed away from the sun, was stubbornly, impossibly alive. Her days were filled with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and living animals, a stark contrast to the sterile, frozen world that was descending outside. Her systems were tested before the great storm arrived. A week of heavy, unseasonable rain sent a torrent of water down the cliff face. It poured through unseen cracks, and for 2 days a section of her cavern floor was a shallow lake. But her raised garden beds kept the soil from washing away, and her cistern, instead of being flooded, simply filled to the brim, and its overflow found a natural channel out of the cave. The system held. Another time, a pack of wolves, driven by hunger, found their way to her door. They howled and scratched at the heavy logs, their predatory scent filling the air. Elara sat with her back to the door, the axe in her lap, while Shadow stood before it, a low, constant growl rumbling in his chest. The door, mortared and solid, did not yield. After an hour, the wolves moved on. She had built well. Then winter came in earnest. The first blizzard was a prelude, a warning shot. It buried the landscape in 3 feet of snow and kept her inside for a week. But inside, life continued unchanged. The fire burned, the animals were warm and fed, and the first tiny green tomatoes began to appear on the vines. She felt a quiet pride. She was utterly alone, sovereign of a tiny, functioning world of her own making. She had everything she needed. The great storm arrived in the 3rd week of January. It was not like other storms. It came without warning, a monstrous wave of white that rolled down from the Arctic. The people of Providence would later call it the Great Freeze of '83. The wind was not a sound, but a physical presence. It screamed like a banshee, a solid wall of force that tore at the very foundations of the town. It was a hammer, beating against the world of men. In Providence, the attack was devastating. The temperature plummeted to depths no one had ever experienced. The very wood of their homes groaned and cracked in the abyssal cold. Windows shattered inward, spraying rooms with ice and snow. Mr. Gable's grand storefront window, his pride and joy, exploded like a gunshot in the first hour. Roofs, not built for the sheer weight of the snow that fell in a solid, endless curtain, began to sag and then collapse. The church steeple, a landmark for 50 miles, cracked and splintered. The community's preparations, which had seemed so sensible, proved useless. Firewood, stacked neatly outside homes, was buried under 10-foot drifts, inaccessible. The livestock in the barns, the town's source of meat and milk, began to die, their bodies freezing solid in their stalls. The carefully salted pork and barreled flour were useless without fire to cook them. The confidence of Providence, its belief in its own sturdy resilience, shattered as quickly as the glass in its windows. They were trapped, freezing, and starving. Inside Elara's mountain, the world was calm. The wind howled and shrieked against the cliff face, but the sound was distant, muted by tons of solid rock. Not a single draft penetrated her clay-sealed walls. Her massive woodpile, stacked neatly along an entire wall of the cavern, was safe and dry. The fire in her stone hearth burned hot and steady, its heat absorbed and radiated back by the geothermal wall, creating a pocket of unshakable warmth. The goats chewed their cud, unconcerned. The chickens slept peacefully. In the garden, under the gentle, flickering firelight, the small green tomatoes on the vines were beginning to show the first blush of red. She was not fighting the storm. She was living in a place the storm could not touch. For 3 days, the storm raged without pause. On the 4th day, the wind died, but the cold deepened, settling over the landscape like a shroud. It was a silent, killing cold. Elara knew the town must be suffering, but there was nothing she could do. Venturing out would be suicide. She tended to her small world, her routine a meditation against the terrifying silence outside. On the 5th night, Shadow lifted his head and let out a low growl. He stood, hackles raised, and stared at the door. Elara grabbed the axe. Then she heard it, A faint, desperate scratching sound. A voice, thin and reedy, broken by the cold, cried out, "Please, help!" She unbarred the heavy door and pulled it open just enough to see. A figure, completely encrusted in snow and ice, stumbled forward and collapsed onto the floor of her cave. It was a boy, no more than 14. As she dragged him toward the fire and brushed the ice from his face, she recognized him. It was Jacob, Mr. Gable's son. He was delirious, his skin a deathly white, his words tumbling out in a frozen gasp. "Father sent me. The last hope. The meeting hall. Roof is gone. People are freezing. My sister. The baby. She won't stop coughing." He pointed a trembling, frost-bitten finger back toward the town. He said, "The cave girl might still be alive." Elara looked down at the boy, and for a long, cold moment, she felt nothing but the bitter memory of mockery. Mr. Gable, who had called her a fool. The town that had whispered and laughed. Silas, who had cast her out. They had left her to die, and now they were sending their children to beg for the life she had clawed from this rock. Her stores were carefully rationed. She had enough for herself and her animals to last the winter, but not enough for a whole town. To help them would be to risk her own survival, the very survival she had paid for with her blood and sweat. But then she looked at the boy's blue lips, and she thought of his baby sister coughing in the dark. She looked at the warmth of her fire, the impossible green of her garden, the life she had nurtured in this place of death. What was it all for, if not this? Her choice was clear, made in the silent space between one heartbeat and the next. It was not about them. It was about her. She would not let them die, not because they deserved her help, but because she was capable of giving it. She worked quickly. She wrapped the boy in goat hides and placed him by the fire, forcing warm broth between his lips. Then she turned to her stores. She filled a large sack with dry, precious firewood. She filled another with potatoes and carrots from her garden. She wrapped fresh goat cheese in cloth and filled a skin with milk. Lastly, she went to her tomato vines. They were heavy with fruit, small but vibrantly red. She picked a dozen of the ripest ones and placed them carefully in a basket. It was an impossible harvest, a gift from the heart of the mountain. She had built a small, sturdy sled from split hickory for hauling firewood. She now loaded it with her provisions. She strapped a small lantern to the front, its candlelight a fragile beacon. She wrapped herself in her warmest skins, pulled Shadow close, and said, "We have to guide him back." The dog seemed to understand, pressing against her leg with a low whine. Together, they stepped out into the killing cold, into the heart of the storm's aftermath, to save the people who had thrown her away. The journey to Providence was a descent into a frozen hell. The world was alien, a landscape of white and gray, the very air so cold it burned the lungs. The snow was deep and crusted with ice, and every step was a battle. Jacob, weak but revived by the warmth and food, stumbled behind her, his hope rekindled. Shadow was their guide, his keen nose finding the buried path where Elara's eyes saw only an endless, rolling sea of snow. The sled was heavy, and more than once it overturned, forcing her to repack her precious cargo with numb fingers. The 2 miles to town took them 3 hours. They found what was left of the town huddled in the ruins of the meeting hall. One wall had collapsed, and a makeshift barricade of broken furniture did little to keep out the wind. A single, pathetic fire sputtered in the center of the room, consuming the last of their splintered chairs. The faces that turned to greet the sound of the door were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and smudged with soot. They were the faces of people who had given up. When Elara stepped through the doorway, pulling the sled behind her, a stunned silence fell over the room. They stared at her as if she were an apparition. She was not a starving victim. She was alive, healthy, and carrying food and fire. Their minds could not reconcile the image of the foolish cave girl with the savior standing before them. Mr. Gable rushed forward, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning hope as he saw his son alive. He grabbed Jacob, holding him tight. Then his eyes fell upon the contents of the sled, the firewood, the root vegetables, and then the basket of tomatoes. He reached out a trembling hand and touched one, his fingers recoiling as if from a hot coal. A fresh tomato. In the dead of the worst winter in living memory. It was not just food, it was a miracle. It was a judgment. He looked from the impossible fruit to Ilara's calm, steady face. The arrogance and pity were gone from his expression, replaced by a profound, shattering humility. His voice, when he spoke, was a ragged whisper that carried through the silent hall. "We were wrong," he said, tears freezing on his cheeks. "My God, Ilara, we called you a fool. We were the fools." In the corner, huddled with his own shivering family, sat Silas. He saw the sled, he saw the food, he saw the tomato in Gable's hand. He stared at Ilara, the woman he had dispossessed and condemned to death. His face, which had been set in a mask of sneering pride, crumpled. He could not meet her eyes. He simply stared at the frozen floor, a man broken by the weight of his own cruelty and the undeniable truth of her survival. Ilara did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat. There was no triumph in her victory, only a deep, quiet purpose. She looked at the shivering, desperate faces around her and felt not vengeance, but a weary compassion. Her response to their shame was simple, practical kindness. "There is food," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "Build up the fire. The children should eat first." She set down the supplies and began to show them how to feed the fire for maximum heat, her actions speaking a language of forgiveness and grace that was more powerful than any words of condemnation could ever be. She was not just their savior, she was their conscience. When the great freeze finally broke, it left behind a changed world. The town of Providence was shattered, but its spirit, saved from the brink by the woman it had scorned, was not. The immediate aftermath was a period of quiet awe. The story of Ilara's survival, of her impossible cave garden, became the only thing anyone spoke of. The derisive nickname, Cave Girl, was retired in shame. No one dared speak it. Instead, they began to call her home the Hearth, a place of warmth and life in the heart of the cold stone. Slowly, people began to make the journey up the mountain. They did not come to mock, but to learn. They brought what little they had to trade: tools, cloth, preserved goods salvaged from the wreckage, for a taste of her fresh goat cheese or a handful of her winter vegetables. She taught them how to mix clay mortar that would seal a wall against any wind. She showed them the principles of thermal mass, how stone could hold the memory of a fire long after it had died. She shared her knowledge freely, holding nothing back. Silas could not bear the new reality. He could not stand the looks of respect directed at the woman he had wronged, nor the quiet contempt in the eyes of his neighbors when they looked at him. One morning in early spring, he packed his belongings and left, heading east. He vanished from the story of Providence, a bitter footnote in a legend that was just beginning. The impact of Ilara's methods spread beyond simple survival tips. As the people of Providence began to rebuild, they did so differently. New homes were built with deep stone foundations, their cellars dug into the earth to take advantage of its stable temperature. Walls were made thicker, sealed with knowledge learned from the hearth. The town began to work with nature, not against it. Her shelter became a landmark, a testament to resilience. Travelers passing through heard the story and carried it with them, spreading the tale of the woman who grew tomatoes in the dark and saved a town that had cast her out. The landscape itself, once a symbol of her exile, was now the source of the community's renewed strength. Years passed. Ilara never left her home in the mountain. She expanded her garden, her livestock thrived, and her small, self-sufficient world flourished. She remained a figure of quiet respect, a wise woman sought out for her practical knowledge and her unshakable calm. She never married again, finding her companionship in the steady presence of shadow, the rhythms of her farm, and the profound peace of the mountains. One summer evening, she sat at the entrance of her cave, watching the sun set over the rebuilt town of Providence. The windows below glittered like jewels, and the thin plumes of smoke rising from their chimneys spoke of warmth, family, and life. Shadow, now old and gray at the muzzle, rested his head on her lap. The air was warm, and from deep within the cave came the sweet, earthy smell of ripe tomatoes. She had been given nothing but a rock and a judgment, and from them she had built not just a shelter, but a life. She had learned that true strength is not the power to fight the storm, but the wisdom to find shelter in the places others have deemed worthless. It is the quiet courage to build in the dark, and the grace to share the light with those who once left you in the cold. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in the power of resilience and the quiet strength of character. And follow for more inspirational stories of courage, survival, and the wisdom found in unexpected places.